Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the Constitution and American Life off the cuff here with the four Bs. We are looking forward to having a discussion today on creating constitutions, a comparative perspective. And we're going to rely heavily today on Dr. Williams, the more silent of the four of us, to kind of carry the ball in this session. And to some degree, I think it kind of bridges fairly well with our last subject, in which we were talking about myths and misunderstandings of the Constitution. And I don't know, I won't speak for all four of us here, but I do think there's a general belief that Americans, as a tribe, have very little knowledge of their Constitution, just in general. They have maybe bumper sticker phrases and bumper sticker ideas about the Constitution. There's a reverence for the Constitution, but that's not backed up with a real strong foundation of understanding of the Constitution there. And probably nothing sticks out more than the fact that, and as educators, I think, we're partly to blame, is that very, very few people understand the actual creation of the American Constitution, the debates, the tensions involved, the time it took, and just how close it was to not being ratified. And so that inspired us to look at, the creating of Constitution and the factors that go into that, and not only the American Constitution, but to get that international perspective. But I want to start off first with Mr. Kavanaugh here, and that is, and really it's to all of you, but we'll start off with Chris. So when you're looking at Constitution making and you're talking to students, in your opinion, what are the factors? What are that go into the recipe for Constitution making? That is, what are the things that, as we study that, the categories you have to consider there? Again, one of those, I guess, ingredients would be history. The history of the country is a major ingredient in the Constitution making. Are there any other elements to the recipe there, Mr. Kavanaugh?
Well, I think one of the key things, it's not necessarily an ingredient, but maybe, it's like maybe making a cake that you don't want it to fall, right? If we're going to use that analogy, is there was not an inevitability to this. I think one of the things people think of that, these founders and these framers sprung out of the ground and they wrote this document and everybody loved it. And, just first of all, to make sure they understood there was not an inevitability to this. There were some times where it was very precarious whether or not it would even be ratified or even written. I think the other thing is, Dave, you mentioned the history is like, what pushes folks to, and what specific folks to say we need to have a convention, right? This thing we tried in Annapolis did not work. Our economy is struggling. We cannot get credit. We can continue on these 13 separate paths that we're on, or we can create a stronger central government. So I think the idea of constitution making, making constitutions might be a better way of saying it, because we had 13 models from which to choose state constitutions. And those 13 models had used information from their history, British as well as colonial. So understanding, one, there was not an inevitability to the US Constitution, and there were constitutions already in place for the framers to draw from.
Well, with that, I'm curious, Mike and Tim, would that be an ingredient, and that is precedence? We do have precedents. I'm just wondering, globally, do other countries have precedents other than the Italians? Because I know they've had like 37 constitutions, in the 20th century alone there. But is precedence one of the ingredients in constitution making?
Well, I can't speak to international. I'll let Mike do that. But Chris's point is well taken, that history drives a lot of this. I've often said that the British struggles constitutional struggles heavily influenced Americans. And I have this idea that there was like a 200-year struggle of sovereignty in the British context. Is it Parliament or is it the king? And then outside that struggle, there's another sovereignty fight, and it has a lot to do with whether colonials, and Americans certainly were colonials, whether they were seen as true Englishmen. I mean, they get over here, and every one of their founding charters say, we've made this trip, but we've left, we retain all of our rights as Englishmen, because they didn't want to be defined as second-class people. And the British do that when they call a place a dominion. So sovereignty is a big set of precedents through that 200 years preceding the American fights. And it shows up, I mean, obviously in the Constitution itself. Is it the national government's the supreme, or is the state government supreme? And we still fight about that. We call that American federalism. But the ingredients and the history, I think, that goes into baking the cake in the American context is very important. It's a continuation of precedents and a refining of precedents and sorting through at that particular moment what's our solution to that sovereignty question.
Professor Williams,
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, did you have a question, Dave?
Well, I was wondering, is there, is being a comparative political scientist or a comparativist, I guess is how you would say it. Is that accurate to say that all nations, there is some element of precedence in the creation of their latest constitution or their newest constitution there? Or does anybody create one just out of a blank slate?
No, I don't think that happens, but I think there's degrees of how much constitutions kind of reflect the culture of the societies. Obviously, you think about Zimbabwe's first constitution was written for them by the white colonial powers in 1979, and Black Zimbabweans had no say in it, right? But that became the constitution when they got independence in 1980. So that's a degree to where it can be disconnected. But I think it's more like, I would frame it, I agree with what Chris and Tim are saying, but I think it comes down to like a choice. Like, you have to decide when you're creating a constitution, how much do you want the constitution to reflect the power relations that have existed, and how much do you want the constitution to re-alter, like to change those power relations? And I think, I'll let Chris and Tim and you kind of talk about how that dynamic plays out in the American Constitution, but I think it does. I think there were choices made about what to keep and then what it needed to change. And I think all societies have to decide that at some point in the constitution making process. And so to that extent, yeah, precedent definitely matters, history definitely matters, but some constitutions are written with the idea of radically changing the way things have done. I mean, think about Japan in 1946. Now, again, that wasn't written by the Japanese, but it was written in a way to reflect changing power relations in Japan in a very dramatic way. And in some ways, it's the case study that actually seems to work in some cases. Like, Japan's constitutional democracy has lived on despite the way that its constitution was written in 1946.
Well, can I ask you, because you brought up the concept of culture. Are culture and history synonymous when it comes to constitution creation, or are they two separate ingredients that have to be considered there? Because you've made me think about that. I've always seen culture as a separate entity, but now I'm wondering if you can't separate it from a nation's history. Yeah,
that's a good way of phrasing it. I'm not sure if this gets added, but I mean, you taught me, Dave. You're one of the people that taught me that it's the winners who write the history, right? So just thinking about South Africa, a place I know very well. When you go around and ask African male elders what customary law is, you're going to get a very different version than if you were to go around and ask African women what customary law is. So, but it matters who you ask. It matters who is in charge at that moment. So I think history and culture tend to converge because usually those who have the power to say what the history and the culture are going to frame it in a way that's going to be beneficial for them at that moment. Does that make sense?
Professor Moore?
Yeah, well, that was John Jay's argument in Federalist 2. We have now, whether he's right or not, it's a different issue, but he articulates the historical cultural argument why we should adopt this Constitution. We are a people, which is a cultural statement. And then he goes through a lot of the facets of that culture. And one of those is language and religion and all those kind of things. So for Jay's argument in Fed 2, he would not be able to separate them.
Chris?
I think I'm trying to figure out which one's more narrow. You know, is there one history is such a, well, I mean, I think history is such a broader topic, because if you're talking about everybody's history, because we know the culture culture seems to me to be a very narrow thing. And it's kind of like what Mike said about who writes the history, right? You know, we know the winners write the history, and we've seen this now. I mean, holy cow, if you look at the current debates that are circulating in education now about what gets taught and, you know, that kind of thing. I won't go off on that tangent, but I think I would probably disagree with John Jay and the idea that it's a very narrow culture. It's a very narrow concept, maybe broader than it was in other parts of the world at that time, but it was still a narrow idea of culture where, I see history as a much broader expanse. So
well, the way I look at it is, you know, the ingredient of history as far as the American experience goes is the British. All right, is the foundation of British constitutionalism brought across the Atlantic, and then the cultural aspect is a byproduct of British salutary neglect, which allows us as a people to develop a very distinct perspective on man and government and relations of man to man within a society there. And yes, Mike's absolutely right. At some point they converge, but that's kind of how I differentiate. Someone have a different perspective there?
Well, I'm not a different perspective, but that, I think that point is really good, David. It makes me think of a question. So did we have 13 different cultures then? Or did we have a Southern culture? Did we have a middle culture? Did we have a New England culture? I think there might be a better way to say the more distinct types of cultures that way based upon geography. I think in addition to the history that you alluded to.
Well, and I think that's a very good point. And I would say we have a myriad of cultures, and that's always been the challenge of the United States or the Confederate, whatever our entity is, do we have such thing as a national unified culture either before or after the writing and ratification of that? But I don't know if that truly is unique. You know, I'd ask Mike, I mean, again, we've talked about this. Is there any nation state that does have a constitutional arrangement that is not made up of a myriad of cultures based upon geography and other factors there? Tim or Mike, any thoughts?
Well, I don't know how to answer that, but I'd like to kind of let Mike do that. But I'd like to propose that an important thing maybe to consider about constitution making is what century they're written in. Like, for example, I think the aspiration of the American Constitution project was kind of a modernist, unifying, universal, unitary, a unifying principle, and that's very Enlightenment oriented. I wonder now, say in the 20th century, and then certainly in the 21st century, when we live in a postmodern context, whether it's impossible in a postmodern context to even write a constitution with unifying aspirations within it. So I guess maybe this goes to Mike, because he's more familiar with modern constitution writing in other places, especially South Africa, where there's a tribal component. So does it matter if they're written, constitutions are written in the Enlightenment, rationalistic, modernist when time versus now? I think there might be some differences in terms of how they see this principle of unity or diversity.
Oh, for sure. No, I think you're absolutely right. I think the period in which constitutions are written definitely does matter. And we can go into like more details of that for sure. And David, to your question, no, I mean, I can't speak for every constitution that has been written in every place, but
well, you're going to have to, Mike. You're going to have to.
And here's what it is. Yeah, no, constitutions represent sort of the diversity of their societies, and most societies have, if not diverse cultures, definitely diverse interests, and those interests get incorporated as well.
Right.
So I don't think that makes, I think that's maybe something that we can say is ubiquitous across the constitution writing enterprise, is that you have to make note of those differences.
Well, Tim, your point, and listening to Mike makes me want to ask you a question, Tim, because would you say we have basically three waves of constitution writing in the United States? You know, the initial, then the second and third phase of constitution writing. So like pre-revolution, 1776, we're switching over, we're writing constitutions. Then we, post-revolution, then as we add states, everybody's just kind of copying folks to a degree. Is that?
Well, I mean, historians of the founding period usually say there's two phases. Right after revolution, when they're declared to be outside the king's protection, so they go. All the states write constitutions except Rhode Island.
Well,
and then there's a second wave later in the revolutionary phase. And at a local level, now national level, I think your point's well taken. You've got the articles, and then you've got the U.S. Constitution, and then maybe our third phase is the 14th Amendment phase. So
I was thinking though.
So yeah,
I'm sorry. I was just thinking the differences between that first wave and second wave. Do we see changes in structural composition of state constitutions?
Oh, sure.
So you talk about history.
I mean, yeah, I mean, that goes to Mike's point that sometimes institutional arrangements change to address the current situation. So yeah, as you well know, thanks for the question because you can answer this. But there's the Payne view where a unicameral and no executive was talked about at the revolutionary time frame, and then there's the Madison view where you have to have balance of powers, stronger executive, and bicameralism. So yeah, there was that debate too that occurred in the late 70s and 80s.
So I guess what I'm curious about, so those two phases, what about, I'm just curious about added American states, those states added after 1900. There's a handful. Do they just copy those for that second phase, or are there original ideas in Hawaii, Alaska, Arizona, New Mexico, in some of those Western states? Anybody? And I don't know if anybody has an answer. I'm just curious if we just see, they're just copying down kind of what has become, American constitutional tradition founded in the original constitutions. Anyone have an idea?
I don't know.
Well,
I know in the founding period they had to adopt. It was like if you're going to be like Kentucky, Tennessee, some of those originals, you had to adopt the U.S. Now, again, you could do what you want, kind of under the umbrella of the 10th Amendment, but they had to adopt the federal.
And I'd say to students, this might be a fascinating, research subject because, I've always wondered why Nebraska is unicameral, and it's the only, and Nebraska becomes a state, 1840s or 1820? I mean, it's after the Missouri Compromise, obviously, right? But I'm just wondering why Nebraska went with a unicameral, and it's only one of two states in the union that does so.
I think that might have been Depression cost saving, wasn't it?
It was proposed by a Nebraska legislator to save money during absolutely, that's exactly right. And it's They just went with it and never went back. So, but back to your original question, I think one of the things that's different, I mean, and I don't, the idea of listing rights first, right? We see so many states that are very lock-in nature in terms of listing rights first. I know Indiana is that way. I know North Dakota is that way. We're gonna put the rights up front and then the powers secondary. And I don't know how many. I don't know enough about individual state constitutions to know how much of that is a trend.
So, Mike, for my own edification, kind of help me out with the history of what we now call South Africa. So, how many constitutions does that region have before the current one that they exist under? Is there a English constitution? Is there a Dutch constitution or an Afrikaner constitution?
Yeah.
Kind of give me a sense there of their evolution.
Yeah, sure. So the first Cape Colony was ruled by the Dutch, right? So there was a Dutch constitution there. And then the British come in and take it over from the Dutch, and then the Cape and the Natal constitutions are written. And then the Afrikaners actually go up into the middle of the country and create two brand new republics, and they each have their own constitutions. That's all before the civil war in South Africa called the Anglo-Boer War. And then in 1910 is kind of their moment of unifying. So they get this constitution that unifies these four different colonies, right? That constitution, which did not allow anybody but whites to vote, remains in effect until 1983, when the whites then change the constitution, provide a little bit of power for Indians, what are people of Indian descent, and what are called coloreds, people of mixed race. And that's 1983. And then 1994, you get the first constitution that is written by all South Africans for all South Africans. So I don't know, I kind of lost track there. Probably 7 or 8 different constitutions since 1600s. Yeah.
So looking at our discussion on the role of history and culture, does the current Constitution in any way, shape, or form reflect any of those previous constitutions? Or because of the radical, nature of the changing cultural and political dynamic, does it really just throw all of those, out the window forever?
No, I mean, one of the most interesting sort of things that remain the same are the boundaries between the 9 provinces. In many ways, copy the boundaries of the 4 provinces. They created some enclaves for some other groups, but there's definitely those boundaries are still there. So that's super interesting. The South African flag is a mixture of Afrikaner colors, British colors, and ANC colors. And South Africa has 2 national anthems, one that is sung in Zulu and one that is sung in Afrikaans. So they did their best to sort of bring together these different traditions into one document.
And which, do they have vuvuzelas for both of those anthems?
Vuvuzelas, no.
Man, the World Cup a couple years ago, holy cow, I had a headache every game.
It was unique. I'm not going to say it was that much different from the hooligans of England and the sounds they make, but it was a definitely different perspective. So,
Mike, I had a question about process. Am I right in thinking that their process was like 90 something? Didn't they kind of do let's give this a trial and come back and maybe take a second whack at it? Is that right, or am I wrong on that?
No, for sure. And I think the debate South Africa had about the writing of the Constitution, I think in general are debates any society has. It's like, okay, who gets to write this thing, right? And Nelson Mandela, who was representing the ANC and the Black majority, said, well, we have to have elections first. And then the people who are elected in the office should write the Constitution. Well, the white minority said, no, that doesn't seem fair, because then we're not going to get anything to protect us in the Constitution. So a bunch of unelected leaders wrote the first draft of the Constitution. And it was agreed upon that that draft would then be in effect, and that they would hold free and fair elections. And then that new body would then rewrite the Constitution, write a final one. But they set out 34 what they called constitutional principles that the new final Constitution had to abide by, many of those protecting rights that whites thought were important. And so then they wrote a final Constitution, and then after that, they created a constitutional court that would decide whether the new Constitution met the constitutional principles, of which the court said it did not. And then they had to go back and redraft some sections. So altogether, the Constitution writing process started when Nelson Mandela was released in 1990, and it ended in 1996. It took about 6 years.
See, I think that's fascinating because I see some similarities in the American process. There was a lot of debate about when the Constitution came out of the convention, could the Articles Congress modify it, or could the state legislatures modify it? Could the state ratifying conventions modify it? So I guess that to me doesn't sound that unusual to go through that kind of contorted stages of getting to an eventual document. I just find that fascinating.
Yeah, no, scholars talk about what they call upstream and downstream constraints that when you write a constitution, everyone has to take advantage of or think about. So, for example, a downstream constraint would have been the state ratification committees, right? So
Right.
You know that to ratify it, it's going to have to go through the states. That's going to determine how you write it. If you're going to have a public vote on it, you might write it differently. And then an upstream constraint might be, this is who's going to get to be in the room to actually give it the first draft. And in the United States case, it was the delegates that were there in Philadelphia. They just said, it's going to be us, and we're going to write a draft that everyone then is going to have to accept or not accept. So every society has to decide those constraints to set up the process.
And we were protected from the downstream by deciding, well, let's just have every state have a convention,
Exactly.
as opposed to state legislatures, right? Because then you maybe had multiple houses to get through.
Yeah.
Right.
And so it makes it much more strenuous. So I like that. I like that upstream, downstream kind of thing.
Yeah, I like that. And that's a political science thing too, right?
It totally is. Yeah.
I thought that was Will Rogers. You never dreamed downstream first.
I'm sorry, I confused it with upstairs, downstairs. So my understanding of the ingredients that we've come up with into our Constitution cake here: history, precedent, culture, context. All right, and again, I think that's on target. And who's doing the actual writing there. So I've got 5 ingredients, students, for you to think about when it comes to creating that Constitution. I am wondering, to what degree is it a truism that at the very core of the motivation for writing is crisis, that all constitutions are written out of turmoil and crisis, or am I off base there as far as your historical understanding and observations? Anybody?
Well, help me out here. Is it Maryland that calls for rewriting their constitution? Like every 19, 20 years, something like that. I don't know that they do it, but I think there's a provision for them to be able to do that. Channeling their inner Jefferson, right? The idea that we're going to revisit this every generation or so. So Maryland, I think it's Maryland. I have to check on that, but I don't know. Was it a crisis period? In the United States in 86, 85?
Well, that's kind of what the historians debate, whether it was a true crisis or not. I mean, the Federalists obviously make that argument. The Constitution needs to ride in on a white horse and save the day. I think a lot of the progressive historians of late have made the argument that, maybe not, that maybe the Federalists oversold the crisis. But I think, if the Federalists deserve credit for getting this thing on the right track. I think the fact that they did pitch it as we're at a crisis moment. So I think there's probably something to that. Certainly in our context, the crisis argument. But I wonder too whether Constitution if the 14th Amendment is a constitution of sorts, is that in the middle of a crisis, or is it to prevent another crisis?
Yeah.
So
Well,
I don't know whether the crisis always looks backward or whether the crisis is looking forward. I don't know enough history about how it works in other countries, but
Well,
I think there's something to that.
Well, yeah, we've talked here that we think that the Civil War amendments are in a second period of constituting ourselves, and it is born out of turmoil and probably one of the great crises of our time. Obviously, the first Constitution, the same. I look at the French and the multiple republics, and they all seem to follow some kind of turmoil and crisis. If we see the Glorious Revolution and the English Bill of Rights as a core element of the British Constitution, that's a crisis. If we look at the Chinese Constitution, there's a crisis. The Soviet Constitution there. The Eastern Europeans, that might be a little bit of a stretch. Is it born out of turmoil and crisis with the fall of the Eastern Bloc there? But obviously, South Africa is born out of turmoil and crisis, and then it's looking backwards and probably looking forwards too. I mean, aren't they all, Tim, looking backwards and forwards?
Wow, I haven't even thought about that. I'm gonna punt and let Mike talk about South Africa. I mean, I don't mean that to belittle the question. That's just like really good, and I don't know. I'd have to think about that a little bit.
Well, I think that I'll interject before Mike actually gives us a good answer. I think of the idea that certainly we know that history is one of the primary ingredients in what we're doing. But it's also, hopefully, we think that these are providing roadmaps for us in a way. There are, we call these guys framers, at least they're framing us to a way to continue on, because the way that we were on the path we were on was not working. But I would not say that all constitutions are written in crises, because state constitutions are written, and those are merely to be able to join the club, right? Be able to join the union. Those aren't necessarily out of crisis. They're just moving from territories to states. And your examples, certainly after the Russian Revolution and the Communist Revolution that followed that, and then the Communist Revolution in China, those are back to their countries with a constitution doesn't make them constitutional governments. Because one of the ingredients of a constitution, it provides very limited government, and I would say that in the sense of communist China and the old Soviet Union, those governments were not limited in power.
Yeah,
It made me think a little bit. For American colonials, they saw it as crisis when the king declared them in a state of rebellion. And they said, well, we no longer are under the British Constitution and we can't exist in a state of nature. So they used that logic as we are in a crisis moment because we don't have this British Constitution. We don't have the protection of the crown anymore. So, and they went nuts writing Constitution. So they saw it as crisis and framed it that way. Yeah. But I'm sorry, Mike, go ahead.
No, it's as always, Dave's asking really good questions. And to me, it would be useful to think about to disaggregate or to categorize the different types of crises. So is it wartime? Is it civil war? Is it economics? Because I think that will matter. But the good news is, and I want to share this out because this is just, we'll put it on whatever we put on the YouTube link or something. It's called Comparative Constitutions Project. And it's a political scientist out of Texas and a law professor out of Chicago. They've written a book called The Endurance of National Constitutions, 2009. And this website, they have public open source data for 806 national constitutions that have been written from 1789 to 2005. And they are trying to document all these different factors, how they're written, which powers are in there, were there moments of crisis. I know, Tim, you're smiling. It's a very geeky, wonky political science, count them up kind of thing to do. But the good news for our students is a lot of that information is there where you can start looking and seeing what the trends are and the comparisons and stuff. And I'd recommend that the students or anyone interested in this go check out that website. There's a lot of good data there, a lot of good articles and other publications.
Well, when we look at this idea of turmoil and crisis, is there any kind of consistency as far as Constitution, writing or Constitution creation, as directly responding to that perceived crisis or turmoil, i.e., to what degree, Mike, is the South African Constitution a direct response, all right, to the Constitution of 1910 and apartheid collectively? I mean, is it to fix everything that they found, problematical? Because it seems to me that the American Constitution, in so many ways, is to fill the holes or to fix what are the flaws and weaknesses of the Confederation. Would that be true of the South African Constitution in the 1990s?
Yeah, I mean, that's partially true, but it wasn't just about fixing the history of the past. It was also about coming up with a constitution that could constitute, with a small c, a nation, right? This is where I think, again, there are comparisons to the United States. So, constitution making, you're right, it's about the history, it's about righting the wrongs of the past, responding to something that needs to be responded to. It's also just thinking about, okay, who do we want to have power and why? In South Africa, they said, we don't want to give the provinces what they call their states. We don't want to give them a lot of power like in the United States, because we have these big social, economic issues that we want our national government to deal with. We don't want to have the states deal with them. We want the national government. So you have to decide who's going to exercise power, what history are you trying to fix, but also what compromises do you have to make to keep everyone together? So for example, in the South African Constitution, the white minority very strategically said, okay, we realize we're going to lose political power, but we don't want to lose economic power. So we want a very strong provision on private property, and we want very strong limitations about when private property can be taken and redistributed. And as much as Nelson Mandela and the ANC did not want to offer that compromise, it was one that had to be offered, or white South Africans were simply not going to join. Similarly, the Zulu ethnic group in South Africa desperately wanted chiefs to be recognized and wanted their king to be recognized. And the ANC did not want that either. But today in South Africa, there are 13 kings and queens, and there are over 300 individual chiefs throughout the country. And those positions are protected in the Constitution. It wasn't done to promote, I think, anything like with public policy, other than we have to keep people together. The Constitution needs to reflect all these different parts of our country. And I think that's, again, Tim and Chris, and you can comment, but I think our Constitution, you see a patchwork as well, as they were trying to figure out how to keep everyone together in that room and what they could walk out of that everyone would agree upon. So.
Well, I'm wondering, and I'm glad, what you described, Mike, I thought was right on target. And I'm wondering, this need, this necessity, given the diversity of whether we call them tribes and within the context of identity, this necessity to compromise seems to me in a lot of constitutions to create a poison pill. The poison pill of the American Constitution was obviously the compromise made on slavery. We could also maybe the compromise made on federalism, if they're not one and the same there. And it seems to me that you've articulated there's a poison pill as we look at the 30 years of the evolution of South African constitutionalism. That emphasis on white property rights seems to have stood in the way of South African progress as a nation. Am I accurate in that observation, or am I way off base?
No, there is a segment of South African society, mostly younger people these days, who who will say out loud that Nelson Mandela was a sellout. I mean, and when I started studying South Africa 20, 30 years ago, that's something I never thought I'd hear South Africans say about Nelson Mandela. But the reason they say it is they say what you were just articulating. He took a short-term compromise that is now to the jeopardy of the long-term progress of the country, because South Africa is more unequal today than it was in 1994. And a lot of South Africans look to the private property provision to see the reason why. Now, just to look north of South Africa up to Zimbabwe, Zimbabwe handled it very differently, right? They took away white farms, they tried to redistribute them, and Zimbabwe isn't in a great economic case today. And that's the counter argument. The counter argument is that no, doing the exact opposite of this is not the answer either. There has to be a happy medium. But for people who are suffering in terms of with poverty and with lack of jobs, that's sometimes hard medicine to take. Yeah.
But can constitutions fix that?
Well, the easy answer is yes. That's what they're created to do. Aren't they? They created to solve problems and give us, well, they're created to give us process to address those problems that pre-existed the Constitution and that motivated the Constitution in the first place.
Well,
I mean, America's original sin. I mean, Mike, what you've just described sounds to me so similar to how American historians talk about the witch at the christening, the necessary evil, that presence of protection of white property, and that how that rippled all the way through and still ripples through our history. So it sounds so that tune sounds very familiar to me.
I was thinking the same thing.
Yeah, I think that's what I hear.
Well, I was also thinking about, wow, the younger generation is bashing on Nelson Mandela. Sounds very similar to our cultural historical discussions today and our views of that anybody that pre-existed, I don't know, 20 or 2000 or something.
Can I want to respond to your question about whether constitutions can fix this, or maybe Chris brought that up. When I think about the American Constitution, one of the fundamental debates at the beginning was between Jefferson and Madison, at least for a while, was whether the endurance of the Constitution was more important than the Constitution changing what Jefferson thought, every 19 years or so to reflect the new generation. And what's weirdly comes out of this data from this website I shared is that the average lifespan of these 806 constitutions is exactly 19 years. and these scholars really talk about the American Constitution as being exceptional in that it probably shouldn't have lasted this long. Like, in terms of, they say what a constitution needs, it needs to be flexible, it needs to be inclusive, and it needs to have a lot of details. And they look at the American Constitution, they say, ours doesn't have any of that, the US doesn't have any of that, and yet it has perpetuated. Madison, like the way we put the Constitution literally on a pedestal, like literally in an archive, right? And we bow down to it. That's the argument that has kind of permeated our culture.
Or in Bibles.
And so yeah, I think in some other contexts, constitutions can and should be changed to adapt to the new issues. And we've talked about this in other sessions. In a lot of ways, our policymakers are trying to solve these 21st century problems with an 18th century constitution with one arm behind their back. So it's kind of hard, but I think the argument that we want a constitution that has endured is something now it's just part of our public mythos, right? And we're not going to get rid of that anytime soon, I don't think.
Because I think about back to my original question of the constitutions, because I think Madison, in Fed 10, my favorite part of Fed 10 is not the stuff about factions. It's about what Madison says: the first object of government is to protect the different faculties in men from which property arise. Right? And that's, he's talking about a class system, and he's, the preservation of property, because the fear is that the landed gentry are going to lose that property to a degree. So they want a more secure system to preserve what they have. I mean, that sounds a little Beardsian, I suppose, but
Oh yeah.
well, I mean, I mean, that's Madison though. That's Madison right then.
Yeah.
Whether he believed that or not, I don't know. But so is it?
Well, no, I mean, you're right, Chris. He was very concerned about creditors getting paid back. So you're right. I mean, I wouldn't apologize for Beard's ideas at all. So I think you're onto something there.
So I just wonder, which brings me back to Dave's question that was so good about culture and history, because is it the idea that the culture, our culture is universal in the fact that the people at the top want to maintain that power, and they don't necessarily want to share that power. I mean, we did it for years. We used to do the simulation in my class, was based upon the 3 classes. And when kids got to be in a certain group, because we had stacked the deck in their favor, they're the ones that got to basically rewrite the rules for the game that we would play. And for 25 plus years, 26, 27 years, we did this every year. One of the rules was basically the same. Once a circle, always a circle. And we use geometric shapes, circles, triangles, and squares indicate the circles would be the top, the triangles are the great middle class, and the squares would be lower socioeconomic. And their rule was always the same. It may be written a little bit differently, but once a circle, always a circle. And I think that's something that permeates many cultures.
Yeah. No, in the literature on constitution writing, this is referred to as the issue of institutional self-dealing. So the question is,
all these phrases.
You gave the executive the power to write a constitution. Is that executive going to write it in a way that's going to benefit the executive power? And so there's all different types of bodies that can write constitutions. Sometimes it's executives, sometimes it's just a normal legislature, sometimes it's a special body that's been elected to write a constitution. And sometimes it's just people who say they're going to get together in Philadelphia and just do it, right? So those types of things, I mean, political scientists look at those types of things to see how it matters, and they don't have enough cases to kind of say, to be honest. But I think the assumption that those who are sitting down and writing the document are going to write it in a way to protect what their interests are, I think that's kind of a given. I think we see that in every constitution writing project.
Well, yeah, that's a standard anti-federalist argument, that there was self-dealing at the convention, and certainly the Federalists were involved in it. So I didn't know the anti-federalists had a political science category, a descriptor. That's great. That's great.
You may be a political scientist.
Oh no.
The dark side. You're going to the dark side.
I do want to take exception, Mike, with you were talking about America's exception of its consistency or its constancy, and I would disagree with those individuals who presented that idea. Where our Constitution is not. We've had a crisis. We've had a second constituting, and I would say that through judicial review and other things, in our Constitution, and we've spent a lot of time on this year, our Constitution looks nothing like the Constitution of 1787 outside the frame of it. Yes, we've got 3 branches. Yes, theoretically, we have separation of powers, checks and balances, federalism, representation. But in the nuts and bolts of how government works, again, our Constitution has adapted and changed, like I think many other countries have. So it just,
Well, I mean, I think you're right to an extent. I just think that wouldn't we be better off if the Constitution spelled out more clearly what equal protection of the laws meant? Would we be better off if it clearly spelled out what liberty meant in the Due Process Clause? And I think one of the arguments is that it doesn't have to be as detailed as the Brazilian Constitution, which I think I read was like 64,000 words or something crazy. It doesn't have to be that detailed, but to some extent, we're having debates now about what certain provisions mean in the Constitution, and we've had these discussions, and we leave it up to 9 members of a court, right? Whose ideas of what they mean may be very different than what the public thinks they should mean. So how does the public get involved in the defining of the constitutional provisions when some of these provisions are so vague? I think that's the argument.
Well, I'll plug a book. I'll take Chris's role on this one. There's a great book written by Larry Kramer. I think he's at UC Berkeley. And he makes the argument that through the very slow, gradual pacing of elections over a period of time, the people do get involved. I think the title of the book is The People Themselves.
Yeah, I got that somewhere on the
and
shelf,
he makes the argument that the people do, and certainly your point's well taken, Mike, that justices do get to tell us what all this means. But then there's always the backlash. I mean, we're experiencing this now with Roe. So I think there is the argument for us is that through elections over a period of time, those judges change and the interpretation changes. I don't know that it's a great answer, but that's what the answer is.
I would say that would be true. Sorry, Mike. I would say that would be true at one time. I'm not sure that that's true anymore right now.
Well, you might be right. Yeah.
Sorry, Mike.
No, I'm sorry. I just, it's usually those who don't have power in society that are asked to wait around for the elections to catch up with the reality. So, for example, in South Africa, they have the equivalent of an equal protection clause, but in that equal protection clause, it explicitly states that the legislature has the power to correct racial imbalances. Like they can discriminate, they can do affirmative action because they recognize that there are certain racial inequities that need to be addressed. If we had a clause like that in our Constitution, if that was part of the 14th Amendment, so much of what our legislature could do.
Section 5.
Yeah, what more do you want there, Mike? You got Section 5.
And it gave you 1964. It gave you 1964, man.
Your existence wouldn't even, exist without 1964.
I'm sorry, Mike. You just laid that one right there for me.
All right.
Well, here's even better.
No. I didn't mean to cut you off, but I mean, how? Okay, let me do this scholarly. But how would you address Section 5 in the 14th Amendment? Isn't that what you're talking about?
No, it's not.
Okay.
I mean, I'm forgetting the case law on this, but whites can use the equal protection clause as much as blacks can, right? And in the South African context, they say that that's not up for grabs. We wrote this, that we're writing this equal protection provision with the reality of our history and our culture and what's happened in the past, and we're trying to fix it. And ours was not written in that way, or maybe it was written with that intention, but it hasn't been applied that way and it hasn't been interpreted that way. And I think it's lost some of its force because of that.
So
I was just going to interject. How would, I mean, I don't want to get away from the idea of constitution and constitutionalism and constitution making, but how would the things look differently had we gotten Madison's proposal that would allow national veto over state laws?
Yeah.
That would have been really crazy.
Well, Professor Williams, your homework for the next session is I'd like you to write me a detailed list of fine tuning the Liberty Clause there and giving us some specifics that erase the ambiguity and confusion that we have. You did a pretty good job, on the Equal Protection Clause and referring to South Africa there. But I'd like to see a more detailed enumeration of these rights and powers there. Real quick, we're coming up towards the end, and there is one larger subject. But real quick, again, Mike, you taught me years ago this concept of legitimacy. When we look at the ingredients for constitution making and legitimate constitution or legitimate constitutional governments, does popular voice or popular vote have to be a one of the ingredients or one of the components of a legitimate constitution? Do you believe that somewhere in the process the people have to have?
I think today it does. I mean, to Tim's point, I think that the time it's written matters. The Myanmar Constitution was the one that they got in 2008 that's worked out so well for them. There were secret talks writing that Constitution for 17 years. That's what I read, right? And it doesn't surprise me that that Constitution had little or no legitimacy amongst those in the society and by those political elites, as it turned out. So I think in today's world where small d democracy is so much part of what people expect constitutions to represent, I do think you need some sort of like public participation at some point in the process for it to last. But I think that cases like the United States, and even less so in 1848, which is the other big period of the constitutional revolutions, much more public involvement there than in ours, but still not as much as today. I think it matters, but it's because times have changed, and there's a norm that people should be involved in these types of decisions, whereas in 1789 there wasn't those same types of assumptions.
Well, and I find that interesting because even today, at least at the national level, we have nowhere for the popular voice. We don't have a popular referendum or initiative process at the national level, which seems to be counter to the trend that you identify globally, that in today's world, more popular voices is probably a necessity.
We don't even have a national vote for president. Like we don't have a national anywhere. You're right.
Right. Well, yeah. I don't think there's any national voice for anything. So
there's one little quirky thing about ratification that goes to this issue of popular bottom-up input, and it's Rhode Island. As you may recall, the convention, Philadelphia Convention, said, I don't know whether it was, we ought to have state conventions. Well, Rhode Island said, screw that. We're going to have a statewide vote. So their first whack at ratification was not a convention. It was a statewide referendum. Now, you talk about bottom-up democracy, and obviously Rhode Island is a special circumstance given its size and population and some other things. True democracy in getting the people, to your point, David, legitimacy equals a referendum in our state. And they actually rejected it. Now, later on, they would kind of be coerced into ratification. But so there was some of that rumbling around at our founding period about this question of bottom-up, small d democracy to create legitimacy. Now, the Rhode Island anti-federalists knew damn well that it wasn't going to be ratified because there was tremendous resistance to it. But the process is interesting that it was there at our ratification in one state.
Well, two points, one political and one philosophical. The philosophical one is Jefferson and the idea that legitimate government has to be driving its just powers from the consent of the governed,
right.
Channeling Jefferson in the Declaration. But also, Tim, I learned this from you guys, is that at the state ratifying conventions, they did away with property requirements in most states for you to be able to vote. So that was an expansion of that small d democracy, limited as it may have been for 1788. Yeah. But in most state conventions, you didn't have to have property to be able to vote to send people to the convention in your state. So there was an expansion of the people's voice.
All right. So our last little subtopic here, this is for Tim Moore, and because I know Tim loves these kind of discussions. Here. So I am a fundamental believer that we are in a constitutional crisis in 2021. But given all of the ingredients to constitutional cake making that we've identified, history, precedent, culture, context, who's writing, possibly crisis, I do believe if we were to write one today, Tim, all right, how in what way would it differ from, even the so-called Constitution of 1868? All right, 1787, 1868. How would our Constitution be different today if it's written today?
I don't know that we. This is twice now in this session. You've asked a really great question that I didn't expect this one, David. This is unfair. I don't.
Off the cuff.
Well, I don't know that we get one.
That's fair.
Because I mean, to Mike's point, the demand on front end inputs now is entirely different. I mean, there's no deference, or there's very little deference now to political elites. So I don't know that we get that kind of deference, because I don't think we're recommending that America shows up in all our coliseums and writes a constitution. I don't know that we get the deference for that group to even do the project. And even if we did, there certainly would be tremendous commitments to diversity, and much more so than I think we did. But yeah, I mean, I can't imagine it'd be even remotely close to what we would have now.
If you come up with a way, I would just want to insert one little clause maybe, and that would be to say that any elected official must be able to pass the citizenship test now for high school seniors. That's the only thing I want in there. So to hold political office, you must be able to pass the current citizenship test.
Professor Williams? Yeah, no, I agree, and I think it's. I agree with Tim. I don't know if we get one. And it's a sad commentary at a time in the world where we probably have access to more information than any other generation. We have more experiences to draw upon, where we have all these lessons from history. I agree that our current political, cultural climate, if we open that can of worms, there's no way the configuration of the United States as it is today is the one that we get. I think we break up into multiple different republics or entities, and maybe that's for the next 200 years. Maybe that's the better thing to do. Maybe it is more effective to govern ourselves that way. Yeah. But for those of us who aren't being rational about this and being a little more, I don't know, emotional, that we do not want to see the United States go away as the entity it is today, I find it sad that we probably don't have that reasoned ability to come together and make the document better. We would just fight.
Well, for one of those rare moments, we actually have consensus here, and I can't, I mean, we couldn't even agree on who the delegates would be. We probably couldn't agree where it would be held, although St. Louis would be the logical place.
No, I got a place, the Lincoln Tap. It's right down the street.
You get some delegates already there.
But as students, I do think that's something to think about, as we've given you, I think, some things to reference, and that is these ingredients there. Our history is completely different than it was in 1787. Obviously, the precedent here with, the growth of democracy around the world, and then maybe it's contracting a little bit. I guess the question is, culturally, to what degree we're still made up of multiple tribes, but are we even worse off than we were in 1787 in context? So, when you get a chance, students and teachers, think about that, given some of the guidance that we've given you. We have enjoyed this hour together. Next session, we look forward to hopefully another interesting topic for students and teachers and anybody interested in the Constitution and American life. For now, we wish you well, and peace, love, yogurt, tacos. Bye, 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 bonds.